Okay, so let's kick this off. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to this webinar titled The Nagorno Karabakh Conflict Military Lessons for Middle Powers. My name is Franz-Stefan Gady, and I'm a fellow here at the Institute for International Strategic Studies on Future Conflict. As most of you will be aware, the 44 days of fighting over the disputed enclave of Nagorno Karabakh was the first interstate war fought by conventional forces. Excuse me, there's like a clip in my connection here. It was the first interstate war fought by conventional forces in a number of years, and as a result, it is of great interest, of course, to those of us who study military affairs, and in particular for those of us who are interested about the potential future character of warfare. So in detail, this webinar aims to shed light on the potential lessons to be learned from the conflict in Nagorno Karabakh for the force planning of middle powers. And why did I pick middle powers? Because countries such as the United Kingdom, Germany, Japan, more so than great powers like the United States and China, are confronted by fiscal constraints when making choices about what new military capabilities to acquire in the near future. And at the same time, what existing systems can be phased out in the decades ahead. And all of this, of course, happens in conjunction with doctrine, which we are also going to discuss during this seminar. And because of all of this, I think one could make the argument that the lessons taken from the recent Nagorno-Karabakh conflict may have greater relevance to policymakers among the middle powers than those of the great powers. So here to discuss with me all of this are three distinguished panelists. First, we have Michael Kofman, who serves as director of the Russia Studies program at the Center for Naval Analysis and also is a fellow at the Kennan Institute, which is part of the Woodrow Wilson International Center in Washington, D.C. And Michael just published a great article on military lessons from the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, and you can find it on the website russiamatters.org. I really highly can recommend it. Next, we got Rob Lee, who is a PhD student in the Department of War Studies at King's College London, where he focuses on Russia defense policy. He was previously an Alpha Fellow and visiting research fellow at the Center for Analysis of Strategies and Technologies, which is a defense think tank in Moscow. And as most of you will probably be aware, Rob has been documenting the war on Twitter in intricate detail. So I suggest you all follow him on Twitter, where his handle is at RALee85. And last, we have Gustav Gressel, a senior policy fellow with the Wider Europe program at the European Council on Foreign Relations Berlin office, where he works on Russia, Eastern Europe, and defense policy. Before joining the European Council on Foreign Relations, Gustav also worked in the Austrian Defense Ministry and also served as an air defense officer in the Austrian Armed Forces. He also wrote an interesting analysis on the war, which also can be found on his organization's website, the European Council on Foreign Relations. So just some quick procedural notes. I think we'll do 3 rounds of commentary. The first round will be on doctrine lessons. The second round will be on technological capabilities. And the last round, my personal favorite, will be on what potentially could be the wrong lessons to be taken from this conflict for middle powers. And all of you will, of course, have opportunities to ask questions. But because we're so pressed for time, may I suggest that you type your questions and send them to me rather than raising your digital hand. And I will try to work them in at the appropriate time during our discussion here. So let's maybe kick off just right now with our first round. And I'm going to start with you, Mike. And I was going over one of your threads on Twitter, or rather one of your discussions on Twitter, I think it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, where you made that ominous statement, show me your force structure and I show you who you are. And I think this was really part of a threat on maneuver warfare. So I guess my first direct question to you pertains to this subject. So what do you think are some of the lessons here that can be drawn from this conflict. We have a wider debate here in the United States on maneuver warfare because it's and a big part of this new multi-domain warfare operational concept that is being discussed. So maybe let's kick off with some of your thoughts on maneuver warfare and lessons from the conflict.
Sure. And just one step front, thanks for organizing this discussion. I think it's a great topic. It's good to be here with Rob and Gustav and you. Got caveats on my initial thoughts, which I always do, that look, for me, it's not the 1973 Arab-Israeli war, but it'll do until a more defining and interesting conflict gets here. So as we're thirsty for lessons, we should always be careful how much we generalize from this war to something like a great power conflict with Russia or China, because of the limitations of the militaries that fought in this conflict. When we kind of look at, to me, okay, this was not really a conflict that necessarily is a brilliant story of maneuver warfare. Actually, neither Armenia, Azerbaijan, nor the Russian war with Ukraine are necessarily good stories for that, for those lessons. They're principally conflicts based around attrition. And I think the tactical sensation that people take away from the way the Azerbaijanis conducted this campaign, particularly with drones and what they put up on video, hides the fact that operationally they were pretty slow to break out and they still took pretty significant casualties. I think they're hiding quite a few casualties in this conflict. So to me, terrain, and one of the big conversations I have about myself is the debate on cognitive effects of maneuver warfare, the value in how we interpret the impact of terrain, and how we reflect on that from this conflict. You know, Azerbaijanis made great progress in the south where they were expected to before kind of breaking out, right? But the benefits of terrain to defender were much reduced. I think this is something that a lot of us got wrong because Armenians had huge problems in dealing with the drone campaign, with how they prepared defensive lines, with cover. And in general, it seems that there's a clear problem. And the problem is twofold. First of all, how do you actually prepare yourself? How do you do camouflage? How do you set up these positions in a battlefield where you have the proliferation and diffusion of so many advanced sensors that are pretty cheap, they're expendable, they're fairly high definition, they come backed up with a recon strike package, they themselves are loitering munitions. And the second challenge is, how do you actually expect to succeed in maneuver on a battlefield where you are so easily seen and you are so easily targeted? And what are you going to do to enable that, right? One of the challenges, I think, particularly for US military doctrine, that there is somewhat of a fantasy that maneuver will impose these cognitive effects on the adversary and it'll create multiple dilemmas, which is really a conversation about paralysis of adversary decision-making. And that in and of itself is fundamentally a conversation about how you're going to come up against the military with tremendous advantages in force structure, in firepower, right, in armor, right, or let's say much higher amounts in quantity and capability and what they bring to the battlefield. But you're going to be able to offset those advantages, and you're going to be able to offset them early on because you'll be able to paralyze them. They won't know which way to face. They won't know which way you're going, this and that. And kind of my lesson from this conflict is I don't think that's going to happen. In fact, I think historically those are pretty bad takeaways from a lot of wars, but I think it's definitely not going to happen in this case because it's just not clear how you're going to impose any of these dilemmas on an adversary that can see you in real time, can see whether your forces are massed or dispersed, right? And particularly raises questions about the idea that dispersal at the operational level is a good idea, right? Because you're now dealing with systems that can so easily independently target and are essentially autonomous. A lot of your capabilities, a lot of your sort of semi-permanent objects or things that take hours to move. As commercial means of ISR are increasingly spreading and more available to middle powers and small powers, I think it presents real challenges for the proposition of the advantages you'll derive from maneuver warfare, particularly the cognitive ones. The long story short is you're just going to have to deal with and accept much greater amount of attrition. And if that's the case, then you have to ask yourself a question about force structure, right? And that's why I wrote at some point, I can't remember what conversation on Twitter, so look, show me your force structure and I'll tell you who you are. You can tell me you're buying air defenses, you can tell me you're buying electronic warfare and all these things. If you bought one brigade and stuck it somewhere, that's one thing. If you're a country like Russia that downloads EW capability across companies and battalions and independent brigades, and there's electronic warfare troops in the general staff, right? So there's somebody who's the button for that in the general staff in general. And it's in every single major maneuver formation. That's a very different conversation from I got some electronic warfare, or I bought myself some air defense and here it is. There's a couple of units of air defense. that said, I have a ground force that is largely undefended, but I have some air defense that we bought, right? So that's the big difference. And basically what you get from that is, yeah, the magic of maneuver warfare is not going to solve the force structure issue, right? And I think militaries have to look at how they're going to invest. I'll close out on this, that I kind of see it as a conversation in one of two directions, and turn over to my colleagues. Okay. One, it's obvious, and it has been from conflicts going decades back, that it's better to have a smaller ground force that is much better defended and supported. The ratio of support units to maneuver units has to be much different or better, right? That's essentially, you're looking at Armenia, which had a crazy number of tanks and a very small number of air defense and other support units available for them, right? The second one is, you may have to go in a different direction. We have far more cheaper, expendable, conventional capabilities and platforms, right? To supplement your force with autonomous system. That can be your force multiplier, so that you buy things that you can lose and things that you expect to lose. Because if you're dealing on a battlefield where survivability has a long way to catch up to lethality, you're basically in a place where you just have to accept that reality, that you're going to suffer a lot of attrition up front.
Thank you, Mike. This is very interesting and insightful, and I guess it really runs contrary to what a lot of other militaries, middle powers, but also great powers are currently working on when it comes to this concept of multi-domain operations and presenting multiple dilemmas to an adversary. And then also, I guess one quick comment here would also be that what we haven't seen much discussion on is the whole cyber warfare aspect, which is an integral part of this new concept of providing multiple dilemmas to an adversary, right? So I'm actually interested what will come out in that respect in the next couple of months, specifically when it comes to how cyber capabilities have impacted anything, if at all anything, in terms of the military outcome of this conflict. Let me turn over now to Rob here, and his discussion, particularly that I also found quite insightful, again, on Twitter. We do follow each other on Twitter, so there's a lot of stuff coming from Twitter here for this discussion. And I was just astounded also whenever Rob compiled the casualty figures, or at least posted the casualty figures here of this conflict, just tremendous losses in terms of materiel and also human manpower, of course. So I guess one of my questions here that's particularly relevant for middle powers is, of course, this whole debate about conscription versus professional military forces. Are there any lessons that we can draw from the conflict about which of the two systems would work better in the future?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, when we talk about modern warfare, munitions now, they're more lethal, they're more accurate, they're longer range, and they can be employed faster for a variety of platforms. And something Mike was saying, so basically, if you can be located, that means you can be killed very quickly in modern warfare. And so that basically brings in ISR and whether or not you can prevent an enemy's ISR from acquiring you, locating where you are, and then being able to combine that kill chain and make it together. In the case of Armenia, they weren't able to disrupt Azerbaijan's kill chain, right? And so Azerbaijan was able to effectively use TP2 UCAVs as ISR. They conducted strikes, and then they also were used to laze targets for other fire support assets that Azerbaijan had. And so a lot of lessons are basically, if you are a country and you get into a modern conflict and you don't have those supporting capabilities where you can stop UAVs, where you can, in some way mitigate the role of ISR, the casualties will be very fast and they'll be very quick, and they can really be used to lethal effect. And as you're saying, one thing that I think is a bit of a misconception early on with some of the things that I heard about the conflict, that this is a drone war, it's modern warfare, it's very high tech. The casualties were still very high for Azerbaijan, right? And so even though Azerbaijan had this really dominant kind of technological advantage, the latest figures I saw, they had 2,783 confirmed dead, and there's still more missing. And so the total death total will likely be over 3,000, and that's not including the Syrian mercenaries who fought with them. And then Armenia, it's the same thing. The total was around 3,000. And so I think some people were talking about the role of UAVs making warfare kind of high tech and very different. Ultimately, the death total was still there, and it ultimately meant you still had to have guys seizing fortified trenches, and a lot of that is very kind of traditional style warfare. When we talk about conscripts versus volunteers in this conflict, there are a lot of volunteers, there are a lot of reservists. I mean, a lot of people in Karabakh basically, if you're an adult man, you basically you have a job, and then if war comes, you fight. And so you had a lot of people of various ages who were fighting, and various quality, and you can see that in the videos. And I think on the Azerbaijani side, there's a huge gap between their elite special operations units and their other conventional units, and I think that gap was really significant. But a lot of what I saw in terms of modern warfare, the principles of kind of infantry training, small unit leadership, all those things are still important, right? And in a lot of ways, they're even more important. And so, and I think in some ways, a lot of Western militaries are a little better off in this regard. We're talking about modern warfare because, at least for the U.S., and I think it's true for the U.K., we spent the last 20 years focusing on COIN. Well, a big part of COIN was focusing on squad leaders, developing squad leaders, making them decision makers, right? And maybe making fire team leaders decision makers. Well, that's exactly what we need now in modern warfare. And one of the things happened a few times in this conflict was that if you saw a platoon moving together, that unit can get destroyed very quickly, right? There's cases where an entire Azerbaijani platoon reinforced unit was ambushed, everyone was killed. Another case where a platoon was moving around basically together as one formation, and they came over under artillery fire and basically was destroyed. And there were cases in the Armenians where Armenians would move around with platoon to company size force, and because TB2s could locate them and could then provide that targeting data to an MLRS battery or an MLRS battery that might be using cluster munitions, you can take out a company very, very quickly. And so it puts a premium on tactical dispersion. It puts a premium on having units move out in much smaller echelons than we typically would. And that dispersion is critical. And even at nighttime, thermal optics are so good now that it was a tendency at nighttime to kind of bunch together. That's something we have to work against. A couple of things about this. Discipline was critical. We saw a lot of guys with phones, making videos, putting on TikTok in the middle of firefights. Part of that is a discipline issue. Part of it too in modern warfare, any kind of electronic device you have that's not encrypted that emits a signal like a phone, well, that can be targeted, right? And modern militaries can target that, and they can hit those signals with PGMs pretty easily, right? And that's not just cell phones. That's GPS systems that aren't encrypted, so on. All those kind of things. Simple discipline. If someone screws something up, you can get an entire unit killed because precision guided munitions are so lethal and effective nowadays. So one of the things, discipline was really important. Another element too, again, we focused a lot on the role of TB2s, and I'll talk about some of that later about how significant they were in the conflict. But the decisive battle for Shusha at the end of the fight, a lot of that didn't really involve TB2s that heavily. And basically what it involved was, from the best indication we can get from what's available, is that the weather was extremely overcast in the beginning of November. And so basically TB2s couldn't operate for about 2 or 3 days. We saw very, very few videos until the last day. And instead what you saw was a number of Azerbaijani soft units who made long 3 or 4 or 5 day hikes with limited amount of food and water, and they basically hiked through the mountains, hiked through hills, and they're able to surprise Armenian forces and ambush them west of Shusha. And again, this involved, we saw them carrying SPG-9s, we saw them carrying mortars, we saw them carrying cruiser weapons, right? All that is traditional, just infantry stuff. It's having the physical toughness, to hike without food, without water, carrying old cruiser weapons from the 60s, 70s, old technology, but all those kind of basic patrolling skills, basic small unit leadership, all that stuff still is really critical. And really, the battle was decided, it appears, largely by the performance of Azerbaijan soft and the ability to patrol and to ambush and to fight effectively without a lot of that support that became so famous in this conflict. And so I think one thing to remember is that even though this is a really high-tech war, there's a lot of really high-tech new systems, a lot of traditional grunt stuff is still vitally important, and that stuff isn't going away.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Rob. And I guess my first question would be, and maybe we can discuss this in the second round, is if we are looking at dispersing formations and delegating command authority to lower echelons, how do we guarantee, or do we still need to mass for offensive operations, and how do we quickly mass our formations in order to go in the offensive in this regard. So maybe that's something, I'll put a pin in that. Maybe we can talk about this later, because that's, I think, one of the crucial aspects here that we need to discuss at some point.
Sure.
Let me hand it over to Gustav now here, and to talk a little bit more about the air defense aspect of this conflict. As Rob and Mike already were talking about, UAVs were obviously very prominently featured in the conflict. They had a huge impact. And I guess my two questions to you, Gustav, is, on the one hand, perhaps can we talk about how legacy air defenses really fared against UAVs, and to what degree does this mean that we need to adopt our military doctrines when it comes to the use of certain kinds of legacy air defense systems? And my second question would be a bit broader, and that is are manned aircraft actually still relevant for military powers? Because we haven't really seen them having had a big impact in the conflict, at least from my understanding. Gustav, the floor is yours.
Okay, so manned aircraft were not prominently used, but this has other reasons, more political, strategic reasons than sort of the operational procedures in the war. But I will go dig first into the air defense dimension into that. Yes, air defense, the air defense versus drone battle, it wasn't new to this conflict, because we have seen that in Syria, we have seen that in Libya. We have seen that to a certain part also in Eastern Ukraine, but the decisive effect of drones, if they are unmatched, this is what sort of was more visible in this conflict than it was visible in others. First, from the technical side, because this is partially also a technical issue. The problem is drones or UAVs is, from an air defense perspective, a very wide range of targets. You have very small commercial off-the-shelf quadcopter things, up to very large quasi-aircraft that just are satellite controlled, like a Global Hawk. And of course, the more aircraft-like they are, the more easier they are to be engaged by air defense system. Iran has basically proven the point. The less aircraft-like they are, the more problems traditional air defense systems have to acquire them, because of course they're technically not built to do that. I mean, most of them are modifiable to do better than they did in this war, but it's also not sort of a specific weapon system that now is the cure. The first thing is, across these conflicts, the performance of air defense system was better, the better the network was that integrated different sensors with very different capabilities to create a compiled set of data on what is going on in your airspace. And here, if you see, for example, Russian base defense, of course, from an air defense tactical perspective, base defense is always easier than protecting mobile troops. But still, they did far better. It was far easier, but of course they did far better than, for example, export clients that used air defense system XYZ as a one-off without a data network, just because they basically bought this and moved it around alongside troops. Because as an individual sensor, as an individual shooter, you're pretty much at loss, at least against one class of these UAVs, and that's the problem. So if a middle-sized power wants to invest money and has few money, then sort of sensor network is the way to go. A lot of legacy shooters, or especially gun air defense system, if you still have that mobile gun air defense system, actually would be perfect to hit a UAV if it were in the position to actually see it. The other thing, tactically, and we are talking more about doctrines, what we saw on the Azeri side was, the Germans would call this Kampfplan Drohnen, so an integrated plan how to use a multitude of UAVs with different ranges, different speeds, for the purpose of one single mission that they have to deliver for the overall battle plan. That, of course, was something rather newish than the isolated use of UAVs in other theaters. And that's what caught the attention of people. But it's also something that this is where the air defense now has to come in, because your task as an air defense commander is then to foil that plan. If you, there is no such thing as a total protection on the battlefield. There's no such thing as total protection for mobile troops, but the air defense should be in a position to limit or to deny the enemy an unrestricted use of the airspace around it. And if you can diminish the effectiveness, if you can block certain spaces and times for the use of the enemy, you can preserve your freedom of action. And that was sort of the biggest impact on the drones tactically, was that they have reduced, if not eradicated, the Armenians' commanders' freedom of action to react to unforeseen developments on the grounds. So yes, they did not, sort of like the pictures might suggest, relieve you of all the fighting, but the fighting was easier if you are able to compartmentalize the enemy, to deny it, to bring in reserves or meaningful reserves that can change the battlefield to the other side, and or interdict the formation of new reserves. And this kind of fight for the freedom of maneuver, that's essential to military warfare, since warfare exists. This sort of the lesson for mid-powers is, first of all, they need to recreate field air defense forces. We have still some air defense troops, especially in Europe, which are assigned to air forces, which is nice. There's a proposal why air forces have air defense means, but tactically, it's a totally different thing to protect an airbase than to protect a maneuvering brigade. And this maneuvering brigade, during each and every exercise, needs to have an air defense commander that is doing the air defense stuff with them, that advises the brigade commander, look, you're making yourself very vulnerable if you do this and that. I can protect you better if we rather change the plan of procedures towards this and that route, etc. They need to maneuver with this kind of situation to prepare them mentally for this kind of warfare. This is the advantage the Russian table of organization have it, because as Michael said it, they have electronic warfare and air defense scattered across the entire formal formation, and that sort of in every maneuver there's an air defense commander and a normal sort of tank maneuver force, armored infantry, mechanized infantry commander sitting at a beer over what has just happened and what to do better. And if you concentrate some air defense systems just in the Air Force, where they have very different tactical missions to fulfill, you will never create this kind of lessons or mental awareness to this situation. Investing into sensors and networks, I already mentioned. On the legacy aircraft, the problem is here is what do you want to use your aircraft for? Most UAVs have, as of now, and those UAVs who will be available to mid-sized powers will not have a role to play in air dominance things. They also have range and speed limitations. So they can take over the role from ground attack aircraft like the Su-25, or like look at Poland, they have Su-22s. These mission portfolios, drones can take over, the more sophisticated ones. Attack helicopters, or the good old specialized anti-tank helicopters, I think they are more endangered species than a fighter, because the fighter, if of course, and now there's a big if this Air Force operates the fighter in its full multi-role capability, and they have the ammunition, they have the air network that embeds this fighter to its full operational effectiveness, then the fighter is still a much more versatile tool than a UAV. The problem now, back to Europe, is that most of our fighters are just airspace police thingies. They don't have the armament and the training and you know, the airborne radars, etc. To do anything much more, and that's a huge problem. And now I'm running out of time. For air defense, on the sensor issue, the whole passive sensing thing, so passive radar, direct radio direction finding, tracing the emissions, especially of commercial off-the-shelf transmitters and drones, that's not too difficult. And if you have that, and if you have that in real life, and especially if you have a proper information distribution network, that makes a huge difference in combat, much more than missile A or missile B.
Well, thank you very much, Gustav. And I think you raised lots of questions in my mind, particularly about how much, particularly in Western military powers and middle powers in particular, but also, of course, in the United States, how much we trust be put into achieving air dominance right at the beginning of a conflict, and therefore we can actually disperse our formations without adequate air defense systems to the degree that we expect you're going to swipe the enemy air forces off the skies right at the outset of a conflict, which is probably an antiquated concept, at least. That should be looked at more closely. And it also raises the questions also, to what degree is it really wise to disperse formations and in future conflict when you can't really protect them by air defenses. And I think Michael also wrote about this recently, and Rob also mentioned it in some of his comments. In any case, so this concludes our first round, and as we're really pressed for time, let me quickly run to our next round of questions, which is really going to be much more focused on the technical aspects. And the one question I have for Mike is really the one that came up right at the beginning of the conflict, once those videos were released of UAVs shooting at tanks. So Mike, my really straightforward question to you: has this conflict shown that the tank is obsolete, the main battle tank, that is?
No, and it's not because of my confirmation bias, that because I like tanks, and I do. And of course, videos always surface and people immediately glob onto videos. In general, it seems that people are getting off of Russian air defense export propaganda and globbing onto Turkish drone propaganda instead. That's what I see really the intellectual transition taking place in these conflicts. Because, as Rob, I'm sure will comment, the rest of us should too, Turks have a hard time explaining all the TB2s they've lost in Libya in the last year. They never show us those videos. I said we'd have much more balanced conclusions if Turks were able to show us the tremendous amount of drones they lose in some of these conflicts. But we never get that footage. So on tanks, first, okay, here's my brief bullets on that. I don't know what platform right now is a better combination of sort of firepower, protection, and maneuverability on the battlefield still, other than the tank, and what can better fulfill that mission. If you know what it is, please tell me. Second, looking at this battle space, the only thing that I can see being worse than being in a tank is being outside of a tank and something that's even more lightly skinned, or on foot, because all the people that were in that situation fared a lot more poorly than the people that were in the tank, from what I saw. Third, the problem's not the tank. The problem's for people who didn't buy any air defense or electronic warfare or SHORAD to support the tank. The tank is not to blame. The force structure is to blame, and the culture is to blame, because, you know, culture eats doctrine and strategy for breakfast, right? So if you're a military that talks about the need for electronic warfare and air defense, but you don't buy it because you think the Air Force is going to get this job done, but that's the reality. But don't blame the tank for the fact that you didn't buy anything to support it. Last, let's look at the current tank. Probably if you're a middle power and you're looking at your current park of tanks, or if you're some European middle powers and you're looking at the fact that you don't have any tanks at all, so this is not an interesting debate for you whatsoever, because you think that, you know, the countries that did buy tanks are going to get that job done for you, and you'll kind of be in the back doing maneuver warfare on the flanks. So if you look at a tank, you probably have one of two problems. It is either too expensive or not expensive enough in its current configuration. That's the reality you're facing. Because all ground force vehicles inherently are going to need counter UAS systems, right? They're going to need to be protected against loitering munitions and these types of UAS the way you protected them against ATGMs. Okay, with reactive armor and APS, active protection system, or at least some people certainly did. So that's going to be the reality. And you're going to need to do that for all ground platforms, not just the tank. The IFV and the ATC and the other things are all going to need them. Whatever you plan to jump out into, you're going to get out of the tank and get into something else. It's still going to need a counter UAS system on it. That's the reality. You're not going to get away from that. So the second issue is, okay, your tank's going to have to become more expensive. Another option is, it needs to become a lot cheaper, and you need to get way more of them, because the problem is that some people bought King Tigers and now they're annoyed because King Tigers don't have great survivability against air power, and that was proven a long time ago. And the cost and position curve has gotten even much worse, because now a country with drone fleets, with loitering munitions that are going to proliferate much faster to counters to them, can really put in check the survivability of your much more expensive tank, right? So one of the other answers is that your tank needs to become much more cheaper, and you need to get a lot more of them, right? That's the other solution. So some countries like Russia and others have gone in that direction. The tank is lighter, it's cheaper, it's more losable, it's much more maneuverable, and it's much easier to field operationally. Okay. Okay, that's the long story short. I don't see a problem with the tank. I'll make a provocative point. I did see a problem in this conflict for towed artillery. I actually suspect on the modern battlefield, the way it's looking, if you're in the towed artillery business, you might not be in that business for very long.
Well, that's an interesting point to pick up on at some point, because I also have some thoughts on the subject. Well, in any case, but we're pressed for time. I have to move on to Rob. Thank you very much for your comments, Mike. Rob, I guess one straightforward question to you as well. What was the most important military hardware in the conflict, or the hardware that really had the most impact, in your opinion?
Sure. So if you don't mind, I'm gonna piggyback real quick off what Mike said about tanks, real quick. When you look at the data, right, Armenia lost a lot of tanks. Right, there's over 110 documented visual losses of Armenian tanks are lost, and a lot of IFVs, everything else. You can look at the data and you interpret kind of two ways. You can say that data show that the tank is vulnerable and it's obsolete, or you can look at it and say, okay, once Armenia lost its tanks, they then lost a conflict, and that latter interpretation kind of speaks to the importance of tanks, and that the fact that they couldn't defend those tanks, but Azerbaijan, didn't have the same kind of losses, meant that Azerbaijan could use their tanks effectively and Armenia couldn't, and that was a really critical aspect in deciding this conflict. And as Mike was saying, Azerbaijan had success in the south, right? And that was low-lying terrain. That was the best terrain where Azerbaijan could make the most of their superior armor, and they had better tanks, they had better IFVs, and they used that, right? And they used tanks to penetrate Armenian defenses, to exploit them, and to advance, right? And I think if you ask any Azerbaijanis or the Azerbaijani military, if they think the tank is irrelevant, they would kind of say, what are you talking about? We use it heavily, and they played a really key role in their victory. So I think tanks are still very important. Everything Mike said is absolutely right. There's no reason to think that an active protection system couldn't stop the munitions that a TB2 uses. And anyway, I still think that's very important. In terms of the most important thing and most important weapon system, if you're looking for one kind of explanatory variable that explained why Azerbaijan had such success this time, but maybe not as much in the fight in July or in 2016, the TB2 is that one single platform, right? As well as maybe the role of Turkey in a kind of general sense, and maybe also kind of the unity Azerbaijan had to really pursue a long-term campaign here. And so TB2s, it's a medium altitude unmanned combat aerial vehicle. Turkey's used it heavily this year. They used it in Idlib to great success, in Libya to great success, and then here the really selling point for it is it's not as capable as a Reaper or a lot of the top end UCAVs that we have, but it's cheap. And that means it is something you can lose, and you can lose it, and it's financially and militarily sustainable to lose them at a pretty high rate. And so one thing that Mike was saying, this year alone, Turkey fought in Idlib in February, March. In Libya, there's a lot of fighting in May and April, and then obviously now with TB2s in Karabakh. Turkey lost over 20 TB2s this year, right? They lost 2 in Idlib, lost 2 Anka S in Idlib. They lost, almost around 20 or 15 to 20 in Libya, and they lost another 2 or 3 in Karabakh. And they may have transferred them to the Azerbaijanis, but I think most likely Turkey was actually using themselves. And so again, the fact that Turkey can keep using them this way, right, can keep engaging in these kind of conflicts and lose TB2s at this rate and be able to sustain that tells you something about what's important about them, right? And it's okay that some capabilities aren't on the high end; they're still very effective. And they're developing new ones. They're developing a SATCOM version of TB2, which will be much more effective. One of the things to point out, though, and you're saying this, you're asking before about Gustav about the role of manned aviation. TB2s were very useful, but there are a lot of things they didn't do, right? And so we know that Turkish F-16s were in Azerbaijan, likely performing a defensive counter-air mission to prevent any kind of Armenian aircraft from operating. And allegedly, they shot down Armenian Su-25. In Idlib, F-16s also bombed some of the air defense targets of the Syrian regime that the TB2s didn't want to get too close to. And then, in terms of targeting, TB2, they have 2 munitions, and the max range is 14 kilometers with a MAM, I think MAM-L or MAM-C, with GPS guided, and only 8 when it's laser guided. And they're quite small munitions, so only about 50 pounds, right? So they're not that heavy. And so there's some limitations there. And so they're very effective at destroying or damaging tanks. But one of the most important elements was the ISR capability, right? They could keep them basically, this is a small conflict area. They could keep TB2s overhead basically at all times. They have enough loiter time where they can wait for target's opportunity. That meant that any kind of resupply or reinforcement they could go after and strike. And anytime there's a target that they weren't perfectly designed for, they could then coordinate for a strike for something else. So there's an example of Armenian company that's trying to conduct a counterattack on October 18th in the south. They moved that at nighttime. TB2s picked them up. And at the end of the video that Azerbaijan published, you see a MORS battery fire that basically blanketed a grid square, and it destroyed anything in that area, right? And that's one way they were really effective. TB2s, the munitions weren't that great against well fortified positions, and that's one of the lessons that Armenia really could have fortified the positions much better against an aerial threat than they did. But what you saw as the conflict progressed is that you increasingly saw larger munitions used, and so you saw TB2s, getting grid coordinates for, say, Israeli extra LoRa, precision guided munitions. Those are used on all these positions. You started seeing Su-25s. Turkey also has a laser guided bomb. They equipped with the Su-25s, and so TB2s can laser target for those. We started seeing that a lot at the end on a lot of these really defensive positions that TB2s are having trouble defeating. But again, I think one of the big things to point out, TB2s were very effective, right? And they destroyed a ton of targets. As Gustav was saying, they make it hard to counterattack. They make it hard to mass because they can locate you very quickly, and they can very quickly send those those coordinates back to MORS fire and all these other fire support assets that Azerbaijan had, and they used that effectively. But again, they didn't do everything themselves. And one of the things we saw TB2s destroy a lot of OSA AK and OSA AKM systems. Some destroy Charlotte 10s. Almost every strike on an S300 system we saw was from a Harap loitering munition. We saw Haraps take out OSAs as well, and a number of other systems. And sometimes there would be a cooperative element where TB2s would spot something, they locate a target, and then they decide not to get too close to it to come within range of that air defense system, and sometimes allow a loitering munition or some other kind of munition that would be smaller to actually defeat it themselves. So it's important to emphasize that TB2s were absolutely critical. They're absolute game changer. But UAVs have not made manned aviation irrelevant. It's still important. And there are a variety of different types of UAVs, and a lot of the role they play is to facilitate other fires, facilitate command and control, and conduct ISR, and to do a variety of things that aren't just striking targets, which probably get a lot of the attention for this conflict.
Thank you, Rob. And this was very interesting. And one thing that comes to mind that probably needs to be discussed further also, it's probably not a very sexy topic, so to speak, but it's obviously logistics doctrine also that at some point should be revisited when it comes to lessons learned from this conflict, because of all the hits that the Armenians particularly took much further in the rear. And I think this is really going to be something that middle powers need to be looking at when it comes to logistical operations in the future. Let me just hand it over to Gustav now, where I guess Rob also left off, just to really more specifically talk about some of the technical aspects when it comes to air defenses against UAVs, and particularly how Russian systems did and so forth. Gustav, please.
Well, in Armenia, Azerbaijan, they did miserably. The problem is sort of the most modern on the Armenian side were shoulder-launched short-range air defense systems. And here's the problem: is they depend on the shooter to visually identify and see the targets, which is a huge problem at night. But it's also a huge problem in the day if the loitering munition is very small. Drones are also quite small. The bigger ones are there to be seen, but it's not something they're really designed to catch. And yes, the older legacy air defense systems, they have a huge problem that the radar systems are not meant to acquire such small targets. Then the problem is that their moving target indicator, which is sort of a computer that calculates every echo of the radar, whether this echo is moving, and it discards all targets that don't move at a certain rate, or that don't have moving parts, like a helicopter has a large rotor that rotates at a high speed, as invalid, which is, if you otherwise get a radar picture, is fully cluttered with birds and rocks and whatever, especially in the mountains. So it's that there is a reason for this for moving target indicator to be in an air defense system, but of course they're all calibrated for aircraft. or helicopters. And the drones are much smaller. They have a smaller radar cross section. Their moving parts like propellers are usually not metal. They're plastic, and they're smaller. So the next problem is they're not open architecture things. So you just can't reprogram that, because usually it's hardware-based computing. So you would have to sort of physically modify the computers, which in Armenia's case wasn't done because there was no money for it with most of the systems, and hence they have a problem in Gauge. The long-range air defense systems like the S-300, yes, they're also meant to acquire very different sets of targets. They might have done better with this, as well as in the last weeks when they used the TORs, if they had employed them tactically different, but it's very hard to judge if you don't know the exact quantities and properties of the data that run through the network. There are huge differences that can be done with one system if you get into sort of a different set of data. So it's very hard to judge that from the outside, not sit at the operating desk there. But the problem is with small targets that especially then operate closer to the ground, it's hard. Said that, sort of what have legacy systems or what use have fighters. Well, we have also records that, for example, manned fighters like in Georgia in 2008 could engage drones, even sort of Heron-sized drones, which is quite slow. So for a fast fighter, it's actually not too easy to get them, because the difference in speed is huge, but they get them. And if you, for example, are able to restrict the enemy for using a certain altitude and terrain for their drones because they're shot down, you diminish the effectiveness of the whole operation, because also the main sensor of them is imaging infrared. Imaging infrared has, of course, is very vulnerable to moisture and humidity. There can be overcast, but also ground moisture. If such a drone has to fly very low, their range of seeing things, identifying targets is greatly diminished. So if you push them out of where you're going to maneuver, where you have resupply, where you concentrate reserves, push them away or present them with decoy targets, you can foil these kinds of operations. The problem was that the Armenians in this war had neither the means nor the intellectual sort of creativity to do that. And last but not least, electronic warfare. Armenians had electronic warfare systems, but they were all capable of jamming commercial off-the-shelf drones. These were more or less commercial versions of jamming systems, and they performed probably against very short-range drones, so handheld quadcopters at some isolated instances. But a military sort of a drone that has a military communication set, a much wider spectrum to communicate with its controlling station, like a TB2 or an Israeli Heron, then is not very vulnerable to such kind of jamming. Here, sort of the quality between commercial off-the-shelf, cell phone-based stuff and frequency agile military communication is just too big to make that viable, which is also a lesson learned from middle powers. Just because, for example, in peace operations, we can disrupt certain African or Afghan militias to use drones or to use UAVs or to use cell phones to control IEDs. That doesn't mean that the same systems will perform very well in a theater where you have a state opponent that applies military type communication and electronic warfare systems.
Thank you, Gustav. Very, very, very interesting, and also lots to discuss here, or at least lots of food for thought for future discussions. We are about to run out of time, and I do want to do one last round, and I really have to ask you to be very quick, just 2 minutes each. 1 minute if there's anything that you want to add to what was said previously, and then 1 minute for perhaps the one major takeaway from the conflict from middle powers that you think is that we should remember here at the end of our discussion. So let me start with Mike again.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Okay. Well, I'll probably make several and cheat and I just make one. But for me, the big takeaway is that Look, individual air defense systems do not make for an air defense network, okay? You need to have layers of different types of systems. They need to have a common operating picture with distributed and networked radars. Radars are designed to actually see these types of objects and can present this picture to your systems. They have to be integrated with electronic warfare and tactical aviation. It is no surprise that legacy systems separated by 40 to 45 plus years in technological development from this type of threat are not able to effectively deal with it. That is the expected outcome when you're fielding systems from mid-70s and at best very early 80s, right? I think advanced air defense in some ways can handle it, but fundamentally saturation of unmanned systems and loitering munitions in particular are a significant problem, okay? And last but not least, I think when we look at these conflicts, we have limited takeaways. Yes, air defense in some ways has a spotty record from the way it looks, but system on system contests don't tell you anything. I get very annoyed when I see this, like one TB2 killed one Panzer S1 fielded by Syrians somewhere in Idlib, and massive takeaways are being made from this, right? And it's complete nonsense. And for middle powers in Europe, this is a shared problem. If you look at the Iranian strike on Saudi oil infrastructure, because I don't want anyone to walk away and say that older Soviet air defense can't get the job done, but maybe advanced Western air defense is going to get this cover, or maybe air cover will solve it. If you look at the Iranian strike on Saudi oil infrastructure, right, 2019, the infrastructure was protected by a layer of US Patriots, French Cortals, and Swiss Oerlikon radar gun systems. And you know how many drones they detected and successfully engaged in that strike? None, okay? So it's important to take away that this is not just sort of older Russian or Soviet gear.
Thank you. Rob?
Yeah, so two quick things. One is someone Mike was saying, one is we shouldn't exaggerate, how many lessons are here about how revolutionary things are, right? There's a lot of new technology. It's important to address it, to incorporate it, and to have, to be able to deter it and to deal with those threats. But it doesn't make, most things that we already do now obsolete. Most basic stuff that we do in terms of training, in terms of procurement, a lot of stuff still matters, still important. UAVs aren't, they're not making most, weapon systems we have obsolete. One other part, which is kind of high level, there's a tendency for us to assume that 21st century, wars don't happen like this, right? That wars don't happen where one country fights another country for territory, but they still do. And this kind of goes into international affairs a little, but ultimately, what we saw here, we saw a side that had greater military power, that had greater economic power. It translated into greater military power, greater hard power, and it used that to dictate terms to a militarily weaker side. And ultimately, the world watched this, and no one came to Armenia's aid, right? And there's some lessons to be learned from that, but a lot of them are, basically military power still matters, and countries will still inflict their will on other country through military power. And as much as we might have kind of, idealistic views of the world, that stuff is still very much still true. And I guarantee you other countries have looked at this and they're coming to similar conclusions.
Thank you, Rob. Gustav.
Well, I can only reinforce and support the previous said. I would also add, and war is still about killing people, despite of all the fancy propaganda or pictures about drone sniping a seemingly anonymous tank. It's about shooting people. That breaks the will of the enemy, and this is still sort of the physical law of warfare. And all the technical geek is just to find corners around all the other defenses to kill finally people. So this is what we mentally need to be prepared for. The second thing is, I know that sounds odd in a discussion about high tech or new tech. Old weapons kill as well. Still, a lot of the fighting had to be done physically. A lot of the major roles drone played were rather in the spotting than in destroying fields, so spotting targets for artillery. And you still need to have the artillery. We have been talking about disappearing air defense from our chart of organization. Artillery is still an enormously flexible weapon to the tactical commander. He can direct firepower over large distances immediately. Air Force, you have to call in planes. How many will be there? They have other tasks. They're not at your personal disposal. The quickest way to get such a deal done is to call in artillery. And we had a huge slamming on artillery forces in Europe, especially rocket artillery. And we should look close also at the employment of artillery in this conflict and in some others, because it's still a powerful weapon. The same, of course, said for others. Sensors, a lot of old shooters, a lot of old weapons, a lot of old artillery, a lot of old air defense would still be very useful if it's just fed with different data and if it has a real-time good situation awareness. And this is more about modernizing stuff than buying new fancy stuff. And this is sort of, if I were a budget planner in a Ministry of Defense in these days in Europe, looking into these kind of force multipliers, networks that enable your tactical commanders to be still aware of the situation, exploit weaknesses of the enemies, and be more agile on the battlefield. This is the thing where every euro invested is really worth the money.
Thank you, Gustav. And let me thank all three of you for this excellent short discussion. We're about to run out of time here. And I think, Gustav, what you said is obviously something that should not be disregarded or not be talked about. Also is the immense human dimension to this conflict and the human suffering that it entailed. And this is definitely something that's not going to change, or this is part of the nature of war rather than part of the changing character of warfare, right? And I think that's perhaps one of the lessons also for European policymakers or policymakers in Asia as well, that any sort of conventional war in the future is also most likely going to be rather bloody and entails a lot of human suffering. And I do think that's something that's sometimes forgotten when we talk about the more clinical implications, or at least from a bird's eye perspective, the implications, military implications of such a conflict. Again, I found this extremely useful and a very insightful discussion. And again, let me thank the three of you for participating in this debate here. And on that note, I would also like to thank all of our participants here. I did try to work in some of your questions. My apologies that I wasn't able to get to all of you. And as I said, I also thought that we just didn't have time to actually get some of you to ask questions by raising your digital hand. I apologize for that again. So on that note, have a wonderful holiday season now, all of you, and thank you very much again for participating.